How are we going for time? Shall I start? I'm sure people will keep filing in as we get started, but thank you all so much for coming and your interest in this event. We're really excited to be doing this at Melbourne Connect as part of Innovation Week. Let me first take a moment to acknowledge that we're here in Naarm today on Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country and pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and waterways, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people and their elders past and present. We also pay our respects to the traditional owners and custodians throughout Australia and also throughout the world where we work. We're a global organisation and work around the world. It's, I think, particularly important as we head into the lead up to the referendum on The Voice to really think about the ongoing leadership role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities play, particularly in the social justice space, which is where we sit. And for us, it's just such a great privilege and an honour, I guess, to always work and learn from Indigenous communities. We work a lot with Indigenous communities, particularly in the Northern Territory, including in the space of technology for facilitated abuse, which we'll be talking a bit more about today. So my name's Emma Fulu. I'm the founder and executive director of an organisation called the Equality Institute. We're located here in Melbourne Connect in the co-working space upstairs. And we're committed to advancing gender equality and ending violence against women and girls. We work with organisations all over the world, governments, non-profits, local women's organisations in the areas of research, policy advocacy and creative communications. And our, I guess, vision is to create a world where diversity is celebrated, all people are respected and power and resources are shared equally. So you might be wondering whether we're AI experts, given the topic of today's conversation, and the answer is a resolute no, we're not. We're here to learn really as much as you are. But we come from, I guess, the social justice space, and we are really interested in trying to unpack and understand the implications of AI from a social justice perspective, but also how it can potentially be used in positive ways to advance social justice causes. We know that it's going to become ubiquitous in the not too distant future, and so we really want to think about the potential, both good and bad. We're really thinking, I guess, from our perspective, one, of course, there's incredible economic benefits in terms of improved productivity, reduced costs and creation in new industries. But we also know there's a lot to be cautious about. Historical biases and social prejudice in data, insufficient transparency and accountability, unequal access by marginalised communities, for example. And these issues are not new. We're just going to have to think about how we deal with them in the context of new technology. Social justice issues are systemic in many ways, and they can either be entrenched through technology or potentially transformed. So we've got a lot of questions, and we're really, really lucky today to have an incredible panel of experts to be able to help us unpack some of these issues. They come from the areas of AI, law and social justice, and are really here to help us explore the power, privilege and responsibility of technology and AI. So we've got Associate Professor Sarah Monazam Afani, who's a Senior Lecturer in the School of Computing and Information Systems here at Melbourne Uni. We've got Professor Anastasia Powell, who's the Associate Professor in Criminology and Justice Studies at RMIT, and also Anjali De Silva, who's Postdoctoral Fellow at the Melbourne Law School. So I'm going to come and sit with you all and have a bit of a chat. Can start. I don't want to spend too long just reading your bios. It'd be much more interesting to hear from you directly about your own experience and areas of interest. Perhaps I could start with you, Sarah, an AI expert, and can you tell us a bit more about the branches and types of AI that you're interested? I know people think of AI and they perhaps think it's just ChatGPT, but it's so much more than that. So love to hear about your particular areas of interest.
Working in the area of AI safety and reliability, and I'm interested to advance AI based model, but at the same time my concern is to minimize their error, their failure, and their risk. So I'm a fundamental researcher. I'm trying to understand fundamentals of AI, fundamentals of deep learning, and to find out where they may fail. What are their biases? What are their vulnerabilities? And improve the performance of AI system by addressing these issues.
Amazing, so fascinating. Anastasia, do you want to tell us a bit about your work and areas of interest?
Thanks, Emma. So I'm a criminologist by background, and most of my research and policy work and advice to governments and law reform and so on over almost 20 years now has been around family and sexual violence in particular, and also on technology-facilitated abuse. So I've conducted a lot of research with victim survivors and perpetrators about their experiences of these harms, consulted with stakeholders including tech industries as well as government and community organisations around how we can intervene and address and hopefully also prevent some of these harms. And I guess what interests me and what drives me really in this work is fundamentally to see in Australia where everyone is free from violence and abuse, and more than that, that they're not just free from violence and abuse, but they're actually free and equal to be able to thrive and to reach their full potential. That's the sort of world that I want to see.
Very much with you on that world we're trying to create. Anjali, can you tell us a bit about your area of interest and work?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. I'm a lecturer at Melbourne Law School and an associate investigator with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. So I kind of straddle regulation and tech at the moment and have particular interests in administrative and anti-discrimination and free speech law and theory. And within that, really an interest in hate speech against women and the role of law and regulation in tackling some of those harms. In recent years, that has focused on online speech in particular, as well as encompassing not just the individualised harms to women and to women as a group, but also the democratic harms of that kind of speech. So thinking very much about some of the things that Anastasia just mentioned, including equality of access and participation to democratic processes.
Thank you. So we sort of know that AI is not all great. It's got obviously incredible potential, but we know that it can contribute to harm, and we're going to talk a bit about that. I think often we see the abuse and the misuse perhaps really impacting communities that are already in many ways historically marginalised and discriminated against. And I think we need to be open and honest about these issues, and we need to kind of put them on the table. So I think we're going to start with the dark side first, but I promise we'll get to the hopeful, the opportunities, I think, with tech and AI, but I do think it's important to kind of really get on the table what the realities are for many people. So Anastasia, you've been working a lot in tech-facilitated abuse and violence against women more broadly, and we know that technology has been used and is being used to perpetrate harm against many people. So can you tell us a bit more about what it is, you know, how prevalent it is, who is it primarily being used against, and are you seeing AI interact with that in any way?
Yeah, well, we do know that tech abuse generally, so it's something that any of us might experience, whether it's harmful comments from strangers online or getting targeted harassment or hateful comments on social media, that's extremely common. We know that from our research, about 1 in 2 Australians have experienced something of that nature. But we also know, of course, that violence against women itself in our community and globally is extremely common. We know 1 in 5 Australian women, for example, have experienced sexual violence since the age of 16, and 1 in 4 have experienced violence from an intimate partner or family member, and that these experiences are very much gendered in nature, in that women experience these at higher rates than men, and most often from male perpetrators. What we see in technology is that those patterns continue. So while men and women might be similarly likely to experience general tech abuse out there in the world online, when women experience tech-facilitated abuse, it does tend to be from male, current or former partners, and in the context of ongoing patterns of abuse. So for example, in some of our research, my colleague Dr. Asher Flynn from Monash University has worked with me on this for many years. We've been finding that if a woman experiences image-based abuse, for example, so current or former partner releases an intimate image of her without her consent, she's much more likely to also have experienced stalking, monitoring of her data, controlling behaviours, threats, emotional abuse from that same partner. So it's much more likely to occur in that context. In terms of the role that AI plays in this in particular, we certainly see AI-assisted apps and tools being used, for instance, in deepfake imagery, so imposing people's identity onto existing pornographic imagery. It's interesting to note that the harms of those sorts of behaviours, even though in that particular example it's a fake image, they can actually still be really harmful. And one of the things that we hear from women often is that the harm is very similar to if the image was a genuine image. And I think part of the reason for that is that we still live in a society where women's value, their worth, their role as parents or, friends or partners is still judged very much on their sexual reputation. And so these sorts of harms continue to have a huge impact. One of the other examples that we see AI-assisted abuse in is around language processing tools. So we see things where they might be designed with a relatively good intent of detecting abusive language or threatening language, for instance, but women who've experienced domestic violence will say to us that their perpetrator is able to use these tools to help them to form more veiled threats. So take out the things that are really obvious to all of us that we could go, that's abusive behaviour, but she's experienced violence from this person in the past and she understands the pointedness of the kind of veiled commentary that they're making in those communications, and yet it's never serious enough that she'd report it to police because it doesn't actually have the swearing or the threat in it. And if there's one last comment that I can make, one of the other things I think that I'm really concerned about, and I think my colleagues on the panel will also be concerned about, is actually at the broader community level. I think I'm really concerned about the way that automated decision processes about the content that we have, the spread of misinformation and disinformation is actually working to amplify inequalities. It's really shifting the needle of what's acceptable in our community and shifting the needle of what we'll tolerate in terms of discrimination and inequality and abuse. And I think that's where there's a real danger to recognise and to interrupt here, that we don't want to see technology continuing to amplify those inequalities and to actually embolden more people to engage in forms of harassment and abuse.
Yeah, thank you. That's scary and quite confronting, isn't it, when we think about that? And perhaps leads me to Anjali. You're kind of working in that hate speech. You're talking, about the use of technology. And the use of technology within hate speech and the use of hate speech. I wonder if you can share a little bit more about the role you're seeing in that area and whether you're seeing AI also being used in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, Anastasia, you've covered quite a lot. And so I might speak to a couple of points that I think are specific to this phenomenon of hate speech. So tech-facilitated abusive communicative conduct is, I guess, a subset of what might be considered broader tech-facilitated gendered abuse. And then within that subset of communicative conduct, we have conduct that is that functions in a way that might lead us to label it hate speech. And there are different theoretical approaches to identifying what hate speech might be, but broadly speaking, the critical race and feminist work in this area identifies hate speech as speech that acts to functionally subordinate and silence target group members at whom it's directed. Online, women experience hate speech more regularly and more vituperatively than do other groups. So both in terms of the prevalence and the nature of abusive communicative conduct that women are being subjected to online, women are particular targets. Now that manifests intersectionally, as you might expect, so women of colour, lesbians, disabled women all experience this kind of speech differently and often more harshly. And trans women, for example, experience hate speech on the basis of their transgender status and also on the basis of their actual or perceived female sex in different contexts. So all of it manifests intersectionally, and it reflects the biases and the systemic oppressions that are present in the physical world. These are just manifesting in particular ways online. One of the ways that I think hate speech and the harm that it does is distinct is that it harms women individually in terms of the women at whom it's directed. It harms women as a group in a causal sense, so by causing women as a group to retreat from public life, to change their behaviours or their speech in particular ways in order to survive online environments that might be hostile to them. But it also is constitutive of harm. So it enacts and it reinforces social norms that uphold patriarchal value systems because it recreates the world that we live in. That's the way that speech functions, by being constitutive of our realities and our social imaginaries and a range of other norms and practices that means that where this kind of speech is being broadcast to a very large number of people, as it is online, it's not just the particular woman who's being targeted that's being harmed, but all women as a group who are having their subordination reinforced in a patriarchal society. I think one of the main ways that AI maybe to take a step back, digital technologies in general have exacerbated these harms, and I'm happy to go into more detail if people are interested or have particular questions. But broadly speaking, we see phenomena like networks and group polarisation increasing the virulence of some of this speech. We see things like the online disinhibition effect, meaning that perpetrators are often speaking to women online in ways that they just wouldn't speak to them in person, in real life. And we also see that the harms are suspended and extended in time and space. So a lot of the image-based abuse that constitutes hate speech against women, or a lot of the language that constitutes hate speech against women that occurs online, is searchable for decades afterwards and remains online and has a footprint online in ways that in-person hate speech just doesn't. AI, thinking about AI in particular, generative AI, as Anastasia said, is a really sort of distinct and quite frankly terrifying problem. So not just thinking about deep fakes, but thinking about how bots and language models replicate some of this language directed at women and other minorities, and obviously the potential that that generative AI has to create non-consensual pornography and other image-based abuse. I think AI also intersects in a more positive way, and we'll probably talk about that later, in the sense that it offers some potential for identifying and responding to some of this speech on a more mass scale than manual moderators are currently able to do, but I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, no, thank you. I mean, I think it's fascinating to think about this idea, and we can perhaps unpack it in the next segment, but this idea of social norms and how, one, they're informing obviously what we're seeing in our society, but then reinforcing and entrenching and potentially amplifying some harmful social norms that we're seeing that happen. And I think it brings me to a question now about really moving into this AI in particular, and really thinking, we're talking, it's sort of aggregating what we know and from a data perspective, but can you tell us how a bit more, for those of us who don't really understand AI, about how the systems actually learn from the data that they're trained on, and then what happens if that data contains historical biases or, racial biases or social norms that are unequal and discriminatory?
So training an AI model or teaching an AI model is like teaching a new concept to a kid, to someone who doesn't know. And they learn what we teach them, and they don't get all the concept. So for example, if you're teaching about soccer to a child and you just use images of men playing soccer, so that kid doesn't have any concept about that, okay, women can also play that game. It's not just for men. So as the developer, as a curator, this is our job to ensure that our data is not biased, which is not an easy task, definitely. It might not be even intentional, that because you might just go and Google, okay, these are images of people playing soccer, but because this is a male-dominated area, most of the images that we got are men. So it might extend the answer. I'll stop here. So AI system learn what we teach them, but with generative AIs, they can go beyond what we teach them. So we teach them something basic, but they can go and create and come up with new content. Like we might show or teach a kid to draw an elephant, but based on other experiences that kids have, might try to change that representation of elephant. So that's the difference between generative AI and basic AI systems. But again, that bias is transferred to the system.
And so then who is sort of responsible, I guess, or how do you rectify those biases? Is it the human then that we need to unpack our biases in order to be able to be creating more fair AI, or does the AI itself, the machine, responsible for rectifying bias?
So to a great extent, we are passing our known and unknown biases to the system. Sometimes we may not think thoroughly about the problem, or even we might come up with a fantastic model that works for now, but in 5 years' time, the condition might change. And that model doesn't fit with the new circumstances. So that's where bias is transferred from human to the system. But sometimes because the model is not well developed or not well designed, it's biased. It learns feature and content which are not the main features. So for example, you might train an AI system to identify airplanes. And you might be surprised that after a while, for example, it might be able to identify airplanes while they are in the sky, but not when they are on the ground. Because it recognizes a sky or associated sky with airplane. Again, lack of diversity in the data and ill-designed system can cause bias.
This is a random follow-up, but does it concern you then if the vast majority of people designing AI are relatively homogenous, in the sense that male-dominated, perhaps predominantly from a certain, socioeconomic class, because then they're going to have a lot of unconscious bias that they perhaps don't even think about in there?
Exactly, that's what you mentioned. So, for example, if you look at softwares that rank people based on beauty, it fails So, okay, I touched something. I didn't want to go to data. Can I take it back? So it first, unfortunately, ranked people with like no scarf, long hair, people who are younger, have more makeup than even male, and with who are fit, then people of color, and after that, people who wear a scarf or have hijab. So in this, you can see lack of data as well as individual biases, also where that those softwares or systems were designed, how the beauty is judged.
We see this in a criminal justice setting, of course, a lot, that, criminal justice decision making, and there has been algorithmic based criminal justice decision making, particularly in the US, and it's based on prior data of the decisions that judges make. And if those decisions are inherently biased, if they're more likely to deny bail to African Americans, for instance, then that data feeds into the tool, and the tool is more likely to deny bail to African Americans. And it's got nothing to do with the characteristics of the particular crime. It's based on those racial biases that have been passed down implicitly in the data. So I think we're starting to see this in a lot of different parts of our community, in the way that those decisions are being made, and in ways that don't seem to have enough human oversight either to make sure that actually we're making the decisions that we think are fair and reasonable.
And I was just going to add to that. I think even, this draws on Sarah's point, even where there is human oversight, we are constantly feeding our biases into the models. And I think, the Facebook advisory board is, the Facebook oversight board, is a really good example. There are cases coming out of that. This is an institution that's supposed to be kind of a quasi-Supreme Court for content moderation on Facebook, both manual and otherwise. But there's already sort of cases and precedent coming out of that would suggest that maybe we're not even picking things up all the time at that level, and that's not necessarily because the Facebook Oversight Board is worse than any other institution or individual making these moderating decisions, but it's because they are inherently placed within the same cultural context in which the hate speech functions and thrives and is occurring. So there are cases out of the board already that indicate that, for example, some categories of hate speech, so for example, particularly virulent forms of homophobic speech are more likely to get picked up than more ubiquitous, normalised, misogynistic speech. And that's not to say that we shouldn't regulate and moderate homophobic speech with absolutely everything we've got. It's reprehensible, but it's really interesting to see where we see the harms and where we don't. And it's often the more embedded, normalised, the language that takes hold the hardest within our societies and our cultural practices that is most invisible when it comes to moderation. And so where you've got a highly expert panel of people missing these things, what does it say about the algorithms that Facebook is using to moderate its content? Surely those biases are feeding straight back into those systems as well. In addition to bias, I think it's really important to note that AI is fallible in the same way that, or in different ways, and potentially in more ways than human beings are as well. And that plays out in the content moderation sphere, for example, in the sense that AI often can't understand context. So it can't pick up hate speech often that is masked as humorous, or it will pick up humour for being hate speech when it's actually not, or it will pick up in-group language because it can't distinguish between particular words being used by an out-group to demean a target group and that same language being used by the target group as in-group language. So I think both of those things, one more sinister perhaps than the other, feeds into or problematises this reliance increasingly on algorithmic decision making and AI to solve some of these problems.
Okay. Well, there's clearly a lot to be concerned about, but I want to move us forward into thinking about, we know that, you know, there are positive applications of technology, but in terms of, you know, even preventing, mitigating some of these risks. So Anastasia, can you talk us a bit about how technology is actually being used in positive ways, for example, to help prevent gendered violence?
Yeah, so there's always some good news in any story. We do see technology providers developing AI-assisted tools to detect and intervene in, particularly in image-based sexual abuse and in child exploitation material, for example. We also see some of the language processing tools that I mentioned earlier can be used, as you've mentioned as well, to interrupt and to flag harassing and hateful and abusive communications. There are also some limits to that. I mean, as we've discussed already, some of them, but also that, you know, that's only where the content can be monitored and is open to monitoring. So if it's on, you know, end-to-end encrypted platforms, for instance, you know, that will create a barrier to that sort of monitoring. We've also seen a lot of AI-assisted tools for help seeking, and I think that's a really positive and interesting area. So we see, for example, a lot of chatbots for assisting victims of domestic violence or mental health or in image-based abuse. And those are really good examples of what can happen when you do consider gender and inclusion in the design of a tool or of a system. So of course we know, and it's quite well documented and criticised now, that some of the early helping chatbots were very good if you asked it a question about self-harm, but had nothing to say and didn't know what you were talking about if you asked it about sexual assault. Gladly, a lot of that is being corrected over time, and we're seeing progress in that. But there's still a long way to go, and I think it does speak to what we were just talking about earlier about the need for there to be diversity and inclusion in the design process, and actually thinking about, you know, what are the potential uses of this tool or this platform? You know, have we got all the right people in the process and consulted, you know, all the way through in the design of it? One last example I just wanted to draw on as well. We had some conversations in our research with some tech companies recently, and one talked about experimenting with an AI tool to further detect sexualised imagery of women online, so in a more general sense of the way women are represented, and they're trying to intervene in that. And they talked about the sort of ill-intended effect, which was that when they were, you know, running this tool, they would then find, well, there was actually very little images of women available that weren't sexualised in some way because of that gender inequality that we do have in our broader society. And so by trying to remove the sexualised imagery, you actually ended up with mostly images of men left over. And so it sort of speaks to that combination of, yes, you know, we need to work with the tech, but also what are we doing elsewhere to be able to create those positive images of women as leaders, women as footballers, you know, women in these different roles where they're not sexualised in some way, and that the technology is not the only part of that solution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll definitely come back to that, a really important point about what we can do to move forward in the future. But Angela, did you want to kind of add anything on where you're seeing some positive examples of it being used either in hate speech or somewhere else?
Yeah, I don't know if this is more relevant to what we can do down the track, but I was just going to tack on to what Anastasia's just said, that idea of creating positive images and positive speech and positive communities around women and minorities is, I think, where a lot of the potential of digital technologies, but also AI, might lie when it comes to tech-facilitated abuse and hate speech. So in the hate speech literature, we often refer to this as counter speech, and we talk about how unringing the bell, so to speak, once something has been presupposed and said about a target group. Unringing the bell is really difficult, but actually, if you're clever with counter speech, there are ways in which you can mitigate or even reverse some of the harms of speech that functions as hate speech. And what digital technologies provides us with is, I think, a potentially really exciting way to do this en masse and at scale, and potentially even through AI in automated ways that mean that those positive impacts of counter speech are amplified where possible and reach the widest possible audience. Just to add to that as well, within counter speech, institutionalised counter speech is really important, and we used to think of sort of the paradigmatic institutionalised counter speech as being counter speech that comes from government. But when you think about the platforms now, they're essentially private companies that act in a quasi-governmental fashion in some contexts, particularly in terms of the reach that they have. And I think counter speech empowered by the larger platforms to reach really large numbers of people at once with positive messages and imagery around marginalised groups is also potentially something that could be quite exciting if we get it right. Now, whether and how we get it right, totally different questions, and I have my lawyer's scepticism and my academic scepticism around that, but I think these are pathways that are really worth exploring.
Now that's fascinating, because the idea of counter speech, because what we know around transforming harmful social norms, for example, what the evidence shows is it's not just enough to say that the norm is harmful. We actually need to replace that with positive alternative norms, and that's kind of what you're saying with the idea of counter speech, and I think that's really fascinating. I remember hearing once this idea of when we were online and we were experiencing a lot of trolling that was clearly being generated en masse by computer generated as well as kind of systematized, and there was a group that was doing an alternative. They were doing what they were calling love bombing, as the opposite of trolling. It's trying to like amplify positive messages in response to trolling. It just sort of reminded me of that idea. So I think there are lots of potentially exciting things that could come out of that. Sarah, bringing you in, what do you sort of see, or what can we hope for in the continued evolution of AI? Where do you see it going in future applications?
In form of justice?
Well, either in whether it can play a role, I guess, in advancing equality in some way. Can you see it promoting that in a positive way?
Short answer is yes.
Good, yes.
But we should wait a little bit. So I guess AI has revolutionized many applications, many problems, especially over the last decade. We have now robots that do surgery. We have autonomous cars driving around town, and they do tasks even better than human. But when it comes to social justice, it's a bit challenging, because as it was discussed before, AI doesn't understand context. And here we need lots of human judgment. Adding that to a huge degree of bias that we as humans already implemented in our beloved AI system. So we can use them now for social justice applications, but we can't fully rely on them. We can't ask them to make decisions. As like the earlier example, they assign higher like prison time to people of color than white people. So they can be used to process the data, they can help us with the process, they can help to provide explanation, but I think it's too early to fully rely on them. Maybe in 10 years' time, when we have a better understanding of how machines make decisions. At the moment, we don't know. We really, really don't know how AI systems work. We have some understanding, but they are not fully transparent to us. They're just black box or gray box, let's put it this way. We have some understanding.
And so then moving forward, obviously it's not going away, but we clearly have some serious concerns about risk and bias. So following on Sarah, what do we do, I guess, moving forward? And thinking about what do we do to mitigate risk, and is it having this kind of the human judgment there? But I guess the other thing that's sort of coming to my mind, I guess, is around how we've talked a bit about how it can exacerbate existing inequalities, or it's perhaps not even as accessible to communities that are already marginalised. What do you think is important as some of these guardrails, for example, or what do we need to do to mitigate this risk and bias?
So I think, okay, there are different aspects to this problem. One is regulations that should be handled by government. Now I'm talking about an AI expert and a developer. So I think what is important is make sure our collected data is, I can't say it's not biased, but has less biases. We need to ensure that the data has diversity, but collecting such data is not easy. We need to make sure that minorities have access to such system, have access to technology. They can, for example, if we are using online images to train a model to make a decision, we need to make sure, even let's say go back to the beauty application, we have enough diverse images from people from different nationality, from different backgrounds. And to make that happen, what we need to make sure is AI or technology is accessible. It fits with their values, with different culture. They don't have language barrier. It's affordable. So these are all the challenges that we have to make sure that what we collect doesn't have much biases. And also, the developers should understand the context. They should understand the culture. They should understand the problem. And having a diverse developer team, if we can have people from different backgrounds, can help us to provide feedback with different perspectives and try our best to generate models that are not too biased.
Yes, amazing. So reducing bias in the data, but also making sure that the teams themselves are diverse and represent different perspectives. Angeli, what would you add to how we can mitigate and risk and regulate the industry?
Look, I think I mentioned a lot of what I see to be the potential before, but a couple of points around the risk mitigation in regulation, I guess. So this is a point that is a general free speech point, but it has now been transferred to the digital sphere, and that is ensuring that our best efforts to moderate harmful content doesn't pick up content that ought not to be picked up. So, for example, the infamous example of photos of women breastfeeding being picked up on Facebook as sexualised hate speech, or sexualised imagery that shouldn't be there. And another example as well, and this is talked about a lot within the sex work community, is sex workers being targeted for their communications within their communities and outside of them. So consensual sexualised imagery being captured while non-consensual imagery isn't. And you know, how those inconsistencies and flaws in the regulatory system then further marginalise particularly vulnerable groups, including particularly vulnerable groups of women who are materially impacted by some of this censorship. So I guess that's one, you know, something to think about in terms of being cautious around regulatory risk. I guess the only other thing that I was going to add is that we know that the internet and digital communication has had some very deeply felt and evidenced benefits for women and other marginalised communities. We know that it's empowered the kind of speech that has led to things like the Me Too movement or the Arab Spring or whatever it might be. It really has opened up communication and journalism and political engagement in ways that hadn't been opened to some of these communities prior. But there's a sense in which the problems around harmful content are so ingrained that it's starting to almost feel like, particularly for victim groups, the cost of doing business. So if you want to be a female politician engaging online, you've just got to put up with the sexualised threats of violence or the death threats or the deep fakes of you in compromising situations. And I think that mindset really needs to shift. This idea that women and minorities just need to put up with this stuff if they want to reap the benefits of the new public sphere that is the internet and online and digital communications. Because without that shifting, I think there's not enough imperative to do the really difficult work that needs to be done to fix some of this.
Thank you. Yeah, great point. And final comment on risk mitigation before I open it up to questions from the audience.
Well, I'd like to see safety by design and, dare I say, equality by design. I mean, in my field, we know that violence against women already existed pre-technology. It's a deep-seated social problem in our community. And we know that the house that violence builds is built on the foundations of gender inequality. So it is taking, and it will continue to take, all of our collective efforts across multiple spheres of our society to fix that problem. So technology alone is not the answer to addressing or preventing these particular harms, but I do want to live in a world where tech companies and designers and developers have at least a twofold responsibility. The first is I want them to do no harm. I really want there to be a consideration when, right from the beginning of a design process, of how to empower users to protect themselves, if that's what's also needed in there, but also to prevent, as much as is possible, the misuse of tools for abuse. That does including greater diversity of people in the design, in the tech process, but also consultation with a broader range of users about their experiences and the way that this sort of harm does actually happen, and thinking about that from the start. And I think it's really important. We often hear platforms say, we're just the messengers, you know, don't shoot the messenger. But I think we've really got to unpack that. Technology is not just the messenger. Technology may not have created all of these inequalities and biases and harms, but they're certainly amplifying them and they're being used to extend them. And then the second responsibility that I'd really like to see, and I just want to note that tech companies are making a lot of money off all of us and all of our data. And so I'd really like to see a bit of social corporate responsibility in feeding some of that money back into education and prevention and into some of the measures that you mentioned about, counter speech and proactive tool development that we could be thinking about to actually, address some of these harms and promote equality and inclusion in the longer term.
Absolutely, show us some money. So do we have questions from the audience?
effectively, you know, in the general panel discussion, everyone agreed that the AI world is reflecting the mistakes of the real world and of the previous digital things, but in fact amplifying them in a way. But AI has owners, right? So we can hold them more to account. I'm just wondering whether there's any legislative or regulatory paths that could cover such a diverse, because it's not, it's images, it's hate speech, it's biases for court cases. It's very abstract. So is there any path for regulation?
I'm sure Angelie has some comments on that, but one comment that I would just make, and we hear this from providers all the time, especially some of the really big firms, is that they are operating in a global world, and legislation and regulation operates at the domestic sphere. So, you know, they're working in a situation where something that might be legal to intervene and moderate on and take down in one country is fine, but not fine in another country, or vice versa. So that's not to let them off the hook. I absolutely agree that we need to be doing more in this space, but just to acknowledge that in a global world that we live in, legislation and regulation does have a lot of challenges. And so part of what I think we also need to do to add to that is about actually working with companies to improve that diversity and inclusion, to improve their processes of representing users with different experiences, and actually making that part of, you know, the way that they operate and do business. Unfortunately, I guess the only way we can do that is to vote with our feet as consumers, and to demand better from them.
So it's not a small question. I guess so. Partly the answer is that there are some existing legal pathways and regulatory pathways that need to be better applied to the online and digital spheres. So, for example, criminal laws around harassment currently, in most jurisdictions, require that the perpetrator needs to have engaged in a course of conduct for it to amount to harassment. But what does that mean when it's cyber harassment that we're talking about, and it's not one person engaging in that behaviour over 20 different instances, but it's actually, 200 people having engaged in it over 2,000 instances, and you can't really identify any of them, and you can't get them under collusion because they're not really acting together, but they kind of are. And it's not really incitement because it doesn't quite cross that threshold, usually because perpetrators are quite clever about not crossing some of those thresholds as well. And so partly the answer is that yes, there could be pathways, but the systems and laws that we have in place are really badly outdated and can't keep up with the technological advances. And partly the answer is that we need to be more creative about how we regulate the online and digital spheres. And, we've got some models popping up across the globe. We've got the Online Safety Act that is being proposed in Australia. We've got the Digital Services Act that offers some examples of how things might be done. We've got some voluntary codes of conduct that have been placed on the big platforms at a regional level, and all of them offer some examples of advantages and benefits that might come with particular ways of doing things, but all of them have gaps and flaws, and we haven't quite landed on a few, let alone one approach that works and will work effectively. So this is why I have a job as an academic, and it will be my life's work to keep writing about how I think some of this ought to be regulated. But I think sort of the overarching sense I have of it now is that what we actually need is not one piece of legislation to tackle it, or not one approach, but rather an ecosystem of legal and regulatory and counter-speech mechanisms that work at various levels to counteract some of these harms. There's no one panacea, and there needs to be cultural change that will partly occur through law, and will partly be enforced through law, but actually will need a much larger project for it to be effectively addressed.
I think we've got time for a couple more over there.
Thank you. Thank you for such an interesting panel. I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts on, because you talked about how we need better regulation, or like better moderation of these kind of like open sites. But you also talked about how AI might not be able to moderate on sites that are encrypted. So I'm thinking if you have any thoughts on kind of like striking a balance between having better moderation where we're not allowing hate speech on these open sites, but also not moderating it so much that all of that just kind of like disappears into like sites of the internet that are not possible to moderate.
Any thoughts? Anyone?
Not a ton of thoughts on solutions, but I will say again, you've touched on something that I think is really interesting in the digital and online context, but is actually kind of one of the questions at the heart of hate speech regulation more generally. So hate speech scholars have written and thought about this problem quite a bit, which is to say, how do you address this speech without driving it underground where it potentially causes more harm by fostering hate within closed communities, essentially, or how do you regulate it without martyring the people who are doing the hate speaking, without allowing them to kind of be some kind of example for, you know, non-censorship and free speech, etc., etc. So a really interesting question. I don't have a lot in terms of solutions at the moment, but I think part of it might be just being really careful about how we delineate between public speech that is properly able to be regulated in a liberal democratic jurisdiction and private speech that ought to be allowed to some extent to act as quote unquote a release valve for some of this, and also not to overstep into legitimate political communication as well. Yeah.
I mean, it's also complicated by the fact that the current model of moderation is by human beings who, in many cases, who it's an incredibly traumatizing job, and you can imagine that's your job, to moderate and identify abusive content online, and the people that are often employed in those roles are also often from historically marginalised communities, often in low socioeconomic groups, often outsourced into certain countries. So there's a whole industry, actually sub-industry around moderation that's incredibly problematic as well. So there's potential benefits from removing that burden from people to technology, but in a way that is kind of able to consider all these nuances, which is, I guess that's kind of a big job that we're trying to think about how you get to that point as well. So really great question, not a clear answer. I think we've got maybe, how are we going for time? 5 more minutes? So maybe Loxy, and then next to Loxy, sorry, Loxy, do you want to go, and then the man next to you?
Thank you, and thank you so much to the panel for such an interesting discussion. I guess my question is around wanting to understand the AI sector a bit more, so maybe this is a question more for Sarah, given you work there. Some of the things that were just raised about, some of the practices that we hopefully would want to see AI, individuals who work in AI or organisations who are building AI do, like design for safety, have a diverse team of people who are working on consulting. I think that is like an incredibly important piece. Are we seeing organisations who work in AI who do those things? Are there examples of just a proactive approach by existing AI organisations doing that, or is the motivation coming from somewhere different? I guess. Thanks.
I guess the trend is much slower than we like, and with more recent regulation that enforced from different governments in Australia, Europe, I guess people start to think about it. But it's still, because these regulations are not fully clear, people don't know what to do, and there's a lot of investigation, but there is not much action. So they started looking into these challenges, but it might take a while to get to see some signs of improvement.
Just add to that sorry, and then I had to clear my throat. But one of the really positive things that we can be doing is working with the next generation that are studying these courses now. And so we are starting to see some tech companies that are actually investing in education programs as part of their social corporate responsibility, to actually try and make sure that we are thinking about safety by design. We are thinking about equality and inclusion in the way that we teach computing programs. That said, I've also had conversations with some of the managers running some of these programs where they've said, oh my goodness, we couldn't run a subject on that. Like, we are not ready to have those conversations within our team and departments. So I think there's a whole education and tertiary sort of learning piece to do to make sure that we're starting to put these values and ways of working into the degree programs, but we're not quite there yet either.
Thank you so much for that, that great panel. I guess just by way of background for my question, we were recently at the hackathon for AI for Law, and originally we were trying to work on a solution to improve remand rates for bail for indigenous communities. Our original idea that we tried encountered a problem because it was intended to be an indigenous language translation app, and then we found out that so much of the indigenous languages has been lost that there isn't enough data to actually train data sets like that. So I guess my question is, given the millennia of knowledge that we have lost, do we have any pathways to make sure that this kind of knowledge can be applied as data sets too in developing new models?
I guess so. The advantage of generative AI here is that even with little information, they can generate new content. So that's where we can use a good use of generative AI is for such cases when we don't have sufficient data to train our model. So generative AI can be seen as a data curator.
Can I add something to the question, to my answer to the question before? Your question around driving some of this speech underground. So still no solution, but just to say that I think something that's key in all of this is to really think about the harms as well. So there is no sense in which this speech occurring completely underground is not harmful. It clearly is. We know that, for example, incel communities are being nurtured online on the dark web and in various spots that are inaccessible. But I think there is a sense in which we might think about some of this speech being less harmful if it occurs less publicly, at least in the sense of direct harms to target group members. For example, women are being targeted less and might be finding the public internet, so to speak, a less hostile place if some of this stuff is cleaned out from the more public spaces. So that's all to say that I think it's a really complex regulatory problem that you've hit on, but perhaps some of the answer is in thinking really carefully about what the harms are that we want to prevent and to address.
Thank you. Just following on quickly from your comment, and it's a really interesting project by the sounds of it. Is it then also require us to be thinking more about documentation outside of the technology, but just more in terms of, documentation and inclusive data collection and data sovereignty and all of those things? I'm just, as you were talking, it just made me think that there's a bigger picture piece around that potentially as well. Yeah, yeah. very last question from, yeah. Okay, I did say the man behind you had very quick. Can you both, maybe if you both ask your question quickly, then we can answer two at once.
Thank you, Anna, for your speech. And I have a question. You mentioned that AI could be used as a tool to detect and prevent hate speech. And I just wonder, there's a research ongoing about finding trend on digital platforms, not about a specific person, a large group of people, and on the other hand, somehow forming this trend to bring more justice for the target group. Thank you.
And go ahead, and we'll see what we can do both.
Thank you so much for an amazing panel discussion. My question was like culminating this entire discussion, and
As a summary to end on, I might ask each of you to give your final statement of what you think, what we can all do, and I'll then do a very quick summary and we'll close up.
I guess one of the most important thing is educating developers to make sure that they design ensure safety. They try to consider such issues as much as possible. They don't design just a software or a system to perform a specific task, but consider the consequences, the risk, and the harm that it can cause.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sarah wholeheartedly. I think the answer is to keep putting pressure on the big players in this area to act responsibly, particularly given their increasingly quasi-public functions, which I kind of touched on before as well. And I think there is scope for individuals to be responsible digital bystanders, so to speak. So if you see hate speech occurring, and if you feel resilient enough and capable enough to engage in some kind of counter speech, to do so. But having said that, that's kind of the use a paper straw solution to climate change. It's not, it's a much bigger problem than individual users, and as far as many of us go who are victimised by this kind of speech, often the responsibility shouldn't lie with us anyway. To put ourselves in those situations. So I think it needs to be an institutional solution to an institutional corporate problem. To your question really quickly, I think to the extent that AI and other digital technologies can be used to diagnose some of these problems, so to see the trends and respond accordingly, I think that can only be a really positive thing. Yep.
I just want to second the bystander, that one small thing that everyone can do is to engage in that counter speech and to be a proactive bystander, as you say, if you're safe and resilient to do so. I mean, I suppose in my broader focus around violence against women as well, the same goes for being able to support and notice people around you, and whether they, ask the question if you suspect that something's going on, and they might want to talk about it and offer them referral and support. But I think also it comes down to prevention. As we said, technology is not responsible for creating all of these inequalities and abuses in the first place. It's certainly problematic in the way they're being amplified. So what do? We vote. We lobby our governments to continue to invest in prevention, in education, in equality, in anti-racism, and all of these programs that we do as a community more broadly that are also going to go some way towards longer-term change in our online spaces as well.
Thank you. I mean, I think in summary, I think what I got from the discussion is obviously there's a lot of concerns, but this is a technology that's not going anywhere. And that the solution is bigger than technology, that the solution is this sort of whole, it is like you said, coming back to a prevention kind of model and framework. It's a holistic approach that is going to be required. That includes regulation, that includes education, that includes social norm change. And all of us, I think, have a role to play in that. I know it's obviously, you know, the big tech companies and governments are instrumental, but whenever I think about social change and social justice, it's really often about, you know, individuals as well and the power that they can play, whether that's in your own communities or families or in your workplaces, where it's being a bystander or calling out if hate speech is happening or discrimination is happening in a room that you're in, or who's sitting at the table, and can you diversify who's sitting at the table making decisions. We all have a role to play, I think, in those spaces. So I never want us to kind of let ourselves off the hook just by thinking that it's someone else's problem, because ultimately this is, as we've sort of discussed, it's a social cultural problem, and I really hope that we all can contribute in small ways and continue then to hold the big tech companies and governments accountable in what we do. So thank you so much for an incredible discussion and all of your expertise that you shared today. And for you for listening and online, what a great discussion, and so excited to see where this work goes next for all of you. Thank you.